Hi everybody, my name is Victoria and today I am bringing you my February wrap-up. I enjoyed most of what I read in the month of February. I ended up reading 5 books, well technically 4 books and 1 novella. And this month I read 2 classics, 2 fantasy, and 1 historical fiction. The first book that I read in the month of February was technically a DNF for me, but we're gonna count it as a book read because I actually read most of it. I think I maybe had 150-ish pages left to go and I just couldn't do it anymore. But that book was Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Catch-22 is a book that I've had on my shelf for a really long time, actually since high school, and I think it's my longest owned book on my TBR. And in my process of trying to mostly and only read the books that are on my shelves, I was like, well, let's get the oldest book that we own out of the way. So I am glad to have this book out of the way now. But unfortunately, this was a case of a book just not being for me at all. And I'm really glad that I didn't end up reading it in high school, because I know I would not have understood this at all in high school, and I'm sure I would have hated it then as well. Catch-22 is a classic novel centered around World War II. Joseph Heller himself was actually a pilot in the war, and so he brings a lot of his own perspective and his own criticisms of war and the military structure to this book, which I think is a really interesting perspective. I'm glad it's written by someone who went through a lot of these things and can speak from firsthand experience. However, the way that it was gone about did not work for me, did not engage me, and honestly confused me most of the time. In this book we follow mostly our main character Yossarian, although we do follow a pretty wide cast of other characters as well. Yossarian is an American fighter pilot in World War II, and he keeps kind of faking his own illnesses so that he doesn't have to fight anymore in the war. And so when we meet him, he is in a hospital because he's faking his own illness. But Yossarian is doing this because he's quite fed up with what his commanding officers are doing to him. Basically, they're raising the amount of missions that he has to fly, and every time he gets closer to hitting the number, they raise it again. And so he feels like he is trapped in this war that he can never get out of, and they just keep raising the missions and he can never go home. As you're probably already aware, we use the phrase Catch-22 in our daily lives, actually pretty frequently. I know I've used it before I read the book and really understood the book references. I've heard a lot of people use the word Catch-22, and a Catch-22 refers to the fact that these pilots can basically go insane because of what they're subjected to in the military, but the minute that they claim insanity, they're considered sane and they are forced to fly more missions, and so they are trapped. So the idea is that a sane person wouldn't want to fly these missions anyways, but if you claim insanity, they know that you're actually just wanting to get out of the missions. But then again, an insane person would not be aware to actually claim insanity. So there's just this repeating problem, and these pilots are just basically trapped in war and they feel like it's never ending. Throughout the book there's a really wide cast of characters with different flaws and faults, and different chapters focus in on them. What is really difficult about this book is that it is told in a non-linear fashion, so it is not told chronologically, and in every chapter we're sort of trying to figure out where we are, and it very much adds to the impact of feeling like you are in chaos, and gives you that feeling that the pilots also have of being very jumbled and just lost and very confused all the time. And you feel that way when you're reading this, and I believe that was probably a purposeful choice on the author's part. However, there's not really a good way of telling where you're at until you're pretty far into the book, and then you can sort of piece things together. Honestly, I kind of bark noted while I was reading this book so that I would know what was going on and what I was supposed to get out of each chapter. I didn't really have a problem with the story of this book. I didn't have a problem with the themes of the absurdity of war, the strangeness of patriotism, and the corruption that's sometimes possible in places like the military, and the abuse that soldiers take. I'm cool with all of those themes. It's the repetition of this book that drives me insane. It's supposed to be filled with humor, and black humor, mind you, but it's supposed to be funny, and we have these sort of repeating jokes that keep happening. But to be honest, there was so much repetition in this book that I would sometimes question myself that I've actually read this chapter before, and maybe I have just lost my place and like went back a few chapters, because I swear I had read these passages a million times over and over. And this is a long book for that to happen over and over. This book is, okay, it's not as long as I thought, but it's 450 pages. It feels longer. So I think my main complaint with this book is that I think it suffered from having a good editor and from being able to really make this book more impactful and less repetitive. My other complaint with this book is that the characters to me felt a little bit two-dimensional. I didn't really feel like I knew anyone very well, and what we do know about the characters is like everyone's pretty despicable character. Everybody pretty much has major flaws and not a lot of redeeming qualities. And so there were some characters that I sort of cared about, but I'm going to tell you right now, nothing ends up well for anyone. Everything's very hopeless. It was a very bleak book. So I think the combination of just a really hopeless feeling and a hopeless story, and also just not a book that I felt like was written very well, made this book a 2-star read for me. This is my lowest rated book of the year, so hooray! All that being said, I'm glad that I now have this book off of my shelves. I'll probably be unhauling it because I do not plan on reading this book again, and maybe someone else out in the world will benefit from having my copy of it. I will be giving this away, probably to my library or local used bookstore. The next book I enjoyed a lot more, and that was Anne of Avonlea, the second book in the Anne of Green Gables series. Going on further after the series, I was a little concerned that I wouldn't enjoy Anne growing up as much as I enjoyed Anne as a child, but I have to say, Ellen Montgomery maintains Anne's best qualities while also growing her into a more complex character, a more multifaceted character. And so I just found that I enjoyed this book just as much as the first book, but in a different way. There are more life lessons that happen for Anne in this book. She also becomes a teacher, and a lot of this book is what it's like being a teacher, and it's really true to actually being a teacher, because I'm a teacher, and I've just found myself like really relating to Anne in that way, which I found to be a really fun surprise. So much of this book is Anne like falling in love with her students and getting to know them and falling in love with teaching, and I just have experienced a lot of the same feelings. So for me personally, I had a real strong connection to Anne in this phase of her life. This book also struck me with like a sweet sadness, and there's this overarching theme in the second book of the inevitability of change and how it's both sad and happy when life changes and things go forward and you sort of turn a new leaf. And I just really resonated with that. Maybe I'm in a place in my life where I do feel like I'm sort of leaving one phase of my life and entering another, or kind of in the middle of those two phases of life. And to me, this just really hit home personally. L.M. Montgomery knows how to write endings, is what I'm learning. She always brings things together in just like a sweet way that nearly just brings me to tears every time one of her book ends. So I'm just so excited to continue reading the series. I'm loving learning about Anne's life. I can't wait to see what happens next for her. And I just love that Anne still has this sweet childhood innocence to her, even though she's growing up and she is also becoming an adult and learning hard life lessons. And she also has fun antics still, which I thought would maybe stop after the first book, but it still happens. And, you know, Anne gets herself into trouble still. The trouble looks a little different now that she's not a kid. And so I'm just really glad that those essential things that I liked about the first book are preserved and continuing into the further books. So we'll see how book 3 goes. I'm really excited to move on in the series. Oh, 5 stars if I did not already mention, or if you couldn't guess. 5 stars all the way through. Next up, I picked up Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I actually have a whole reading vlog for this. I read this book in the course of 4 or 5 days, and I vlogged the whole experience, so I will link that down below if you want to check it out. Elantris is Brandon Sanderson's first book in the Cosmere universe, and I believe it was also his debut novel as an author. So for me, I had always wanted to start with this book, even though I'd seen various things that said, actually you should start with Mistborn or with Warbreaker, various opinions on the Cosmere and where you should start. But I thought this was just a fine place to start, and I also wanted to see Brandon Sanderson from the beginning, and I'm excited to see, as I read more of the Cosmere books, how he grows as an author. So Elantris tells the story of a city that was once this beautiful place touched by magic, and the people that lived in the city were also touched by magic. They had sort of godlike, immortal qualities, although they weren't essentially gods themselves, but they had very godlike qualities. They were definitely magical beings. And then one day all of that changes when they have this cataclysmic event. They have this earthquake that creates a rift, and for some reason after that there was this terrible disease that fell on the Elantrians, and now all of the Elantrians are basically walking zombies, and they can't die, but they can feel pain, and they just feel pain forever and ever. So every time someone like gets even like a nick in their hand or they stub their toe, you feel that pain forever and ever, but you can't die, and you feel hungry, and if you eat food, you'll just kind of feel hungrier later, and you are just never fulfilled. It's basically hell on earth. And Elantris is also in decay. It is covered with slime, which, ew, gross. And so now these people are just living in this decayed state, and they cannot get out of it. Once you're an Elantrian, you're an Elantrian forever, and you become a zombie. We also have a story that follows the outside of Elantris. There is like a major capital city right outside of Elantris, and it is a kingdom that is at war with some other kingdoms, and there's this whole political system that you learn about, and you follow 3 main characters. One of our main characters that you meet right away is Prince Raiden, or Rowden, I'm probably saying that name incorrectly, and when you meet him, he is afflicted with this disease of the Elantrians, and then because he got the disease, they throw him in Elantris, and that's how we learn about the inside workings of Elantris, is through his eyes. Then you have another perspective of a princess who was supposed to marry the prince, and then she arrives, and then they told her that the prince is dead, but he's just thrown into Elantris. So you learn about the politics of the kingdom through her eyes. Then you have this other perspective of this priest who comes to the capital city and the kingdom to convert everyone to his specific religion. There are basically these 2 different sects of the religion, and his sect is a little bit more extreme, and they're kind of like convert by force and with military power. And so he is there to get to know the political side so that he can convert all the people, and he has this plan to sort of use Elantris as a tool to convert people. If all that sounds really complicated, it's because it is. But I did find that I never was really lost in the inner workings of the politics. It always made sense. However, it did take a long time to really have the understanding of everything, and the political parts of the book were sometimes hard to get through, and really there's not a lot of action. There is action throughout the book, but I would say the bulk of the action happens in the very end of the book, starting about page 400 onwards, and I think it's about a 600 page book, and really the first 400 pages are a build up into the last 200 pages. And that's all well and good, but I can see how some people might feel a little intimidated by that and a little bit turned off by that, because there were definitely some parts where I had to switch to audiobook just because like my brain just couldn't read about any of the politics anymore, and I just, like, my brain just needed a break from that. So I just put my audiobook on for some of those sections, and that kind of helped me push through the little bit more of just the information dumps. So while I did feel like the beginning of this book is a little bit info dumpy, I was really enthralled the whole time, and the ending is totally worth it, and it's just very fast paced from there, and it was an amazing story with really amazing morals that I didn't expect. It's really a very character driven story, and I just really enjoyed what Brandon Sanderson did with this world. I ended up giving Elantris 5 stars. Next up, I listened to the novella called The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. I picked this up because it is set in the world of Elantris, technically, and some of the magic systems that it uses are something that would also happen in the world of Elantris, and something that's possible in that world. And so I believe those books are linked. So I wanted to pick this one up right after reading Elantris. This book is only about 170 pages, and it was really amazing to me how Brandon Sanderson created a very well fleshed out story and characters that I cared about in such a short amount of time. I think that is one of the most impressive things about this short story. And I also thought that the magic system was just so interesting and unique, and I think that's the other reason to read this short story. The basic plot to this story is that we have this main character who is a forger, and she gets captured by this kingdom. She's a bit of a thief, a bit of a criminal, and she forges objects. She is captured by some kingdom officials because they want her to forge a soul. The emperor is basically very sick. He's kind of in a comatose state, and they need her to recreate his soul so that they can put the soul in the emperor's body, and so that the people don't know the difference. So she has to, in a very short amount of time, recreate the emperor's soul. However, it's very hard to do, and only like the best kind of forger, only a forger with the best skills would even have a chance at doing this. And so she is captured, and she has to do this task for them and to try to recreate the emperor's soul. I thought this short story was a fun time. I gave it 4 stars. The last book that I read in the month of February was The Muse by Jessie Burton. This was another book that I had been hanging on to for a long time. It was a Christmas gift, I think a couple years ago, from my husband, and I'm so glad that I got to it because I ended up really enjoying this book. This is a historical fiction novel centered around the Spanish Civil War. However, it also has a bit of a mystery plot to it, so it's kind of multiple genres. I also felt like it was written in a very literary fiction way. It's just written really beautifully. Jessie Burton definitely has writing chops. There were times when I just had to read a passage several times because it was so beautiful. This is a novel with a dual timeline and dual perspectives happening, and so we go between oh gosh, now I forgot. England 1967 and Spain 1936. So in England 1967, we follow Odile Bastien, who is a Caribbean young lady, and she gets a job at this art gallery, and there is this painting that is brought in, and it is by someone named Isaac Robles, and Isaac Robles is a very rare painter. He only painted a couple things, or a few things. And so everyone at the art gallery is freaking out, trying to figure out what is the history behind this painting. Meanwhile, we also have a perspective from Spain in 1936. And in this perspective, we follow a young lady named Olive Schloss. And Olive Schloss is a young lady who, I'm going to put this down because it's hurting me. And so Olive Schloss is a young lady who is a rich white person, and she is sort of on vacation, I would say, her holiday with her family, and you can tell that this family has a lot of money, and they are in vacation in Spain, and then they meet this brother and sister duo who come in, and the sister basically is serving as a housemaid to them, and then the brother is actually Isaac Robles, who we are learning about also in 1967. So that's as much as I wanted to say, because it is sort of a mystery novel from there. The story of this book is really complex. While the mystery was maybe a little bit predictable, I did think it wasn't so predictable, but it was something that ended up being logical. Like, at the end, you're kind of like, oh yeah, of course that would happen, and I should have seen that coming. But I'm just not very good at guessing the ending of mystery novels. You may be better at that. If you read this book, you might see it from a mile away. I also think that Jessie Burton maybe could have done a better job of hiding the mystery from us a little longer, rather than, I think she kind of showed her cards a little too soon. But nonetheless, I thought it was a really compelling story, a really compelling read, really beautiful read. I didn't love some of the characters. I felt like the characters were pretty, I mean, they're deeply flawed, which is fine. I don't have a problem with flawed characters, but sometimes I just really hated them. I had never read a book about the Spanish Civil War, and so that was really interesting and unique for me. There's another book I would like to read, which is the new Ruta Sepetys book, Fountains of Silence, I think is what it's called. And I know that one's also about the Spanish Civil War, so I'd be really curious to read some more historical fiction surrounding that time period. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. It was a really lovely read, and I can definitely recommend it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of February. Let me know down below if you've read any of these. Let me know what you read in the month of February. What was your favorite book that you read last month? I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Keep reading great books, and until next time, I'll chat with you down in the comments. Bye-bye!